Located on the southeast side of the city, the San Francisco Bay Railroad is a Class 3 short line that operates over 5 miles of track in the city and port of San Francisco. The short line interchanges exclusively with Union Pacific and has the capacity to store up to 300 cars. They're also capable of loading over 60 rail cars every day. Primary commodities hauled by the Bay Railroad consist of dirty dirt and various wastes and construction debris from their sister company, Waste Solutions Group. They also took over switching tallow for a nearby industry for Union Pacific. The San Francisco Bay has historically also handled aggregates, biodiesel, cement, rail, ties, containerized cargo, and other wastes. At the time of our visit, the short line used 2 ALCO S-2 switchers for their everyday work, and the crews were very railfan friendly. So much so that we were invited into the cab of Locomotive number 23 by our friends Sam Tannenbaum and Danylo Hawks. At the throttle was engineer Sam Tannenbaum, and directing the train's movements was Danylo Hawks. Although the two men no longer work for the Bay Railroad, they enjoyed their time together and made for a great team. With the two experienced railroaders guiding the locomotive, we would slowly make our way to the yard office and into the middle of the yard. The San Francisco Bay Railroad actually uses goats to keep the vegetation down in the yard, so you'll occasionally see imported wildlife while watching the crews build their trains. ALCO S-2 number 23 was built in March of 1944, while the railroad's other S-2, number 25, was delivered over a year later in July of 1945. A unique spotting feature of number 23 are its front horizontal shutters, as most S-2s were delivered with vertical shutters. Riding in this antique locomotive was a special experience. At the time, number 23 was 72 years old, making it older than many mainline excursion steam locomotives, including Nickel Plate Road 765. Its age is a testament to ALCO's design and the railroad's maintenance. Hopping on at the south end of the yard, we would take a slow ride to 3rd Street before jumping on a section of track that runs literally right down the middle of the road. Before leaving the yard, any train that travels on this section of track must await clearance to cross a double-track light rail system on 3rd Street. This diamond is governed by signals on timers. If there are no light rail trains in the area, the Bay Railroad is given a clear signal, and the light rail system is given stop signals on each main. As we traveled down the street-running section, you can definitely tell that trains can be a surprise to local drivers. Bay crews frequently laugh when seeing the reaction of motorists who aren't always expecting to see a large locomotive running down the middle of the strait.
All right.
The San Francisco Bay Railroad has a history that spans over 130 years. In 1889, the Board of State Harbor Commissioners laid the first track for a new railroad called the State Belt. The short line would play a key role in San Francisco's waterfront development for over 80 years. Before the track was even laid, the land along the waterfront didn't exist, which is why it wasn't included in the original survey of the city. As a result, the fill along the bay would become property of the state of California, hence the name the State Belt Railroad. In the early days, the State Belt was completely isolated from the North American rail network. All cars were ferried in from around the bay. The original tracks were dual-gauged, which allowed the belt to transfer both narrow and standard gauge freight cars to and from both the North Pacific Coast and the South Pacific Coast railroads. Nearly 25 years after the first track was laid, the belt finally connected with Southern Pacific in 1913 at a small yard located at Townsend and Berry Streets. That same year, State Belt constructed a small 5-stall concrete reinforced roundhouse on the corner of Sansom Street and the Embarcadero. The building was renovated in 1984 to look closer to its original appearance and was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1986. The roundhouse still stands today as an office building, but the nearby yard tracks were removed in the early 1990s. When built, the roundhouse stored a modest number of oil-fired steam locomotives that were used to serve the many industrial piers along the city's waterfront. Later on, the State Belt's ALCO S-2 diesels were stored in the roundhouse. In addition to a modest locomotive roster, the railroad also owned 4 freight cars, which were idler flat cars. These cars were used to keep the State Belt's heavy locomotives from rolling onto the car ferries. The short line's ferry slips were located near Fisherman's Wharf on the north side of the city. The 1915 Panama Pacific World's Fair and additional rail traffic to Fort Mason justified the construction of a tunnel, 1,500 feet long, 15 feet wide and 22 feet high underneath the Fort Mason Military Reservation. Eventually, tracks were extended across what is now the Marina District to Crissy Field to serve the Presidio. The tunnel portals remain to the present day, but are fenced off from public viewing. In the 1920s, the Santa Fe built a car ferry operation in China Basin. To connect with the Class 1 railroad, State Belt built a connection track by way of 3rd Street and the Mission Creek Drawbridge. This connection helped increase the Belt's overall business. In addition to the Santa Fe, the State Belt also interchanged with the Northwestern Pacific and Western Pacific railroads, giving its customers a variety of Class 1 connections. As with many railroads at the time, World War II increased trans-Pacific traffic, including freight and passenger rail. Aiding in the wartime effort, the State Belt served the military by moving troops, weapons, fuel, and other materials. In addition to its own locomotives, the Army and Navy provided more locomotives to allow the railroad to handle increased traffic. The State Belt also moved troop trains to debarkation points and picked up hospital trains with wounded soldiers. They also handled returning troops by handing trains off to the Class 1 railroads. In 1945, the State Belt moved a total of 156 troop trains and 265 hospital trains. After the war, industries along San Francisco's waterfront slowly relocated across the bay to Oakland. By 1969, California wanted out of the port business, so the city of San Francisco voters approved a bond issue to purchase the Port of San Francisco. As a result, the State Belt became the San Francisco Belt. 4 years later, in 1973, the city offered to sell the railroad to any operator for just $1. After more than 6 months of searching for a new operator, the city signed a 20-year contract with Kyle Railways to operate the railroad. By this time, belt trackage was down to 58 total miles, a loss of 9 industrial track miles. Toward the end of its existence, local rail fans nicknamed the struggling short line the Toonerville Trolley and the Wooden Axle Line. By 1993, when the San Francisco Belt ceased operations under Kyle Railways, most of the tracks north of the ferry building were either removed or inactive. The only remaining rail activity took place at Pier 96, a newly built container facility near Hunters Point. ALCO S-2 number 23 was chosen to serve the facility and was given a new number, number 49, and a new paint job in 49er colors. At the same time, ALCO number 25 began a long-term loan from the Port of San Francisco to the Golden Gate Railroad Museum at the Hunters Point Shipyard. Not long after, number 49 was also loaned to the museum. The two ALCOs joined State Belt Steam Engine number 4 as part of Golden Gate's San Francisco Railroading Heritage Collection. In 2000, the San Francisco Belt Railroad was renamed the San Francisco Bay Railroad, and both of the State Belt's vintage ALCO locomotives were sent back to the port to serve the repurposed ICTF yard in 2004. In addition to some minor repairs to the number 23 and 25, the railroad decided to convert both locomotives to use biodiesel fuel. This made the San Francisco Bay Railroad the first railroad in the United States to exclusively operate on biodiesel. Going even greener, the Bay Railroad added Knoxville Locomotive Works SE10B number 30 to the roster. The Tier 4 compliant switcher now handles all switching duties at Pier 96. Unfortunately, as part of the grant agreement between the Bay Railroad, the Port of San Francisco, and the state, number 25 was rendered inoperable by torching a hole in the block. It's now on display in the entryway to the Dirty Dirt Yard. Number 23 has been relegated to being a backup locomotive, but hasn't been used with any regularity since the KLW locomotive arrived in March of 2019. Today, Union Pacific's local train, the YSF-70, would meet the San Francisco Bay Railroad and interchange at the yard. This local is affectionately named the South City Switcher and can usually be seen multiple times throughout the week, interchanging with the unique short line. Another interesting aspect of this branch is that it street runs for most of the distance to the interchange on Rankin and Quint streets. At Rankin Street, the crew of the UP local must wait for Sir Costa Iron and Metals ground employees to clear the tracks before proceeding to the interchange point. This street is extremely busy throughout the day, and mass chaos always seems to ensue once trains arrive on the branch. While waiting for the UP local to return with outbound cars, we camped out on the corner of Quint Street and Davidson Avenue. Before jumping back onto the main, we caught the train from the Oakdale Avenue overpass with the city in the background.